Posso? Diga aí onde é que eu saio. E aí eu chamo você, tá? Bom dia, gente. Bom dia a todos. Obrigado pela presença. É um prazer para o MDU, para o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Desenvolvimento Urbano, estar recebendo o curso Gênero, Mulheres e Arquitetura Moderna, ministrado pela professora Mary. E a gente agradece, o programa agradece a articulação feita pela nossa professora Guilana Slavski e os professores Sérgio Marques, do PROPAR da URGS, e a professora Mara Esquinazzi, do PROPUR da UFRJ. Então, essas articulações são muito bem-vindas e positivas para o programa. O tema do curso muito inovador e dialogando com as pesquisas que Guilá vem puxando dentro do programa, com vários orientandos. Então, a gente agradece, and we are very happy with Mary here with us today and these days. E eu espero que todos aproveitem o máximo, dessa oportunidade que a gente está tendo. Eu vou passar para a professora Aguilar, para ela apresentar a professora Mary, e aí a gente começa a aula de hoje, que é, assim, nessa continuidade do curso, o que está previsto para hoje, é esse tema, a continuidade do tema das mulheres e o ambiente doméstico moderno. Para eles ali, está aparecendo? Será que aqui o som está ligado? Precisa desligar aí o som? Só um instante. Gente, agora, pessoal do Rio e do Rio Grande do Sul, melhorou? Pronto, Mara, obrigada. Vamos ver se a gente consegue lidar. Ok. This way, Maria. Quando ela apresentar, ela não quer as pessoas. Isso, a gente vai ficar com ele lá. Ok. Peraí, deixa eu pegar o dela. Se apresentar em inglês. Gente, ok. Bom dia a todos, obrigada pela presença. É com muito prazer que a gente está recebendo a professora Mary McLeod. Foi um prazer também que eu pude desfrutar do contato com ela lá em Columbia University, quando eu fui fazer um professor visitante lá pela Fulbright. Então, foi a partir desse contato que a gente estreitou as relações. Eu quero agradecer também ao PROPAR, na figura de Sérgio Marques, e o ProURB, na figura de Mara Esquinazzi, que realmente proporcionaram a vinda da professora aqui, através do CAP Sprint. Eu vou agora falar um pouco do currículo da professora, muito breve, que ela pediu, para a gente poder iniciar, tá certo? A professora de arquitetura na Universidade de Colômbia, na Escola de Arquitetura e Planejamento, que se chama GSAPP, ok? Onde leciona História e Teoria da Arquitetura e, ocasionalmente, ateliê. Também lecionou na Universidade de Harvard, na Universidade de Kentucky, na Universidade de Miami, no Instituto de Arquitetura e Estudos Urbanos. A investigação e publicações centram-se na história do movimento moderno e na teoria de arquitetura contemporânea, examinando questões relativas às ligações entre arquitetura e ideologia. Hoje a professora vai falar sobre Charlotte Perriand, que ela é especialista, e justamente das relações de gênero. Espero que vocês tenham acompanhado as 3 primeiras aulas e quero convidar vocês
para a próxima sexta também, tá certo? Mesmo horário aqui. Então, vou passar a palavra para a professora América MacLeod.
No, absolutely. Of course, I don't know what Gila said, but I'm teasing. A warm thank you. Can you hear me? Is it working? And is it working online? Okay. Just a warm thank you for this great invitation to come to Recife. It's my first visit here. I already got a glimpse of the old city yesterday and Lena's heritage in the wonderful museum building, and I just look forward to getting to know more. Besides thanking so much Gila and the crew that worked together, this is a really three-university effort between Recife, Rio, and Porto Alegre, where sadly the floods kept me from going. I look forward to another visit there, but also want to thank, besides Gila, Mara, Sergio, and Monica, the latter two from Porto Alegre. Whoa, I'm getting a lot of sort of ambient noise. Are you getting that too? It further away? Then can I advance it this way? Because I'm used to advancing on the computer. Okay. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. I'm sorry for the technical. Oh, it's still. What do we do? Maybe even further? Or is it here? Maybe it's there. Okay. I know it's hard. Oops. I know it's hard to follow English, so I really appreciate the effort. Is that better? No. Can you still hear me? But is the computer really making a difference? Because it seems the same whether it's close or not. Oh, there. If I hold it, it's much better. No?
Som, testando. Som.
You want me to try? I speak up loudly.
Som.
Does it work if I hold the wire? But is it better if I do this? It seems like there's less ambient noise when I hold the wire. I think it's okay. The other thing is, no, but I can also speak loudly if it's better without the microphone. Okay, we try. Whoops. All right, I'm not used to. What? If I hold the mic? see. Is that better? Miracle. Thank you. We need a few. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, let's get started. You've all been very patient. I'm going to give the second part of my lecture from last week, where I was asking the question, how did women change modern architecture? And last week, I focused on Wednesday on kitchens, which I will come back to today, but only shorter, and also housing. But today I'm going to look at furniture, but also look at a focus on one woman, Charlotte Perriand, that I've worked on before. Some of you may have read my long article in a book that I edited. And I hope to illustrate a point I brought up in the very first talk I gave about how important I really think biography is to revising feminist history. And I don't mean conventional, just gossip history biography, but biography in terms of really understanding how women worked, what the conditions of their work were, education, etc. And in mentioning this, I would also like to add that I'll be discussing Perriand's experience as what was called a femme moderne, or a new woman, in France in the interwar period, and her own exposure to the domestic reform movement in France, which I think influenced her approach to design, and modern architecture more generally, and especially that figure you all know too well, I think, in Brazil, Le Corbusier. And as such, I hope we can, in the discussion, consider broader questions about women's role in the modern movement in architecture and the way that modernism more generally reflects or embodies issues of gender. So the same way I did in Rio, we'll take a break after I talk, or if it gets too long, even before I finish, we'll see, given this late start. And then hopefully there'll be a discussion of some of the issues I raise. I also want to mention that tomorrow, I hope to show a little film, very short, that we can discuss. Gila is going to make a presentation on women in the Northeast in Brazil. I hope there'll be some other presentations, but I also want to say I'm going to run the class. What? I'm not tomorrow, excuse me. I don't know if I had enough coffee this morning. We'll see. Anyway, Friday. And I really hope you all can do the readings, because I would like to run it more as a seminar. For those of you who've been online, I think 4 days of listening to me is enough. And I really want to hear your voices. So it really will depend on your engagement as well. And I welcome any contributions from the group or online. Okay, now to the lecture. While more research has been done on Perriand, it's still, tell me what works best with this sound. Well, a lot of research has been done on Charlotte Perriand since I first began my own work quite a while ago. I met her in '78, but I really began seriously working on her when I did the book in the late '90s and early 21st century. But she's still, despite all this research and the incredible oeuvre complète that her son-in-law Jacques Barsac did, she continues to be known primarily as an assistant to Le Corbusier. However, her career spans more than 60 years. She lived a good long life into her late 90s and includes such diverse projects as her extendable dining table and swivel chairs of 1928, I'll come back to it, displayed in her own name, an exhibition stand done with Fernand Léger at the World's Fair in Paris of 1937, portable aluminum cabins for the mountains, 1938. And I'm just giving you a little sample before I plunge in. Furniture exhibitions in Japan in the 40s. Here's one then, and in the 50s. Rustic hotel interiors in the Alps, 1946 to 48. Student dormitories in Paris in the early 50s. Numerous Air France lobbies and tourism offices. And I'm sorry, I don't have the one that she did in Rio in the Copacabana Palace. I went to see it, but unfortunately, last time I was in Brazil, but unfortunately it's been renovated and changed. She also designed furniture here. And if I give another lecture on Periant, I promise to include images, which I didn't have. Also, interiors. Sound is really weird. Interiors of a ski resort at Les Arcs in the French Alps. And she designed and worked with prefabricated bathroom units in the 70s. And finally, I just want to show her marvelous own little ski house. She was an just adamant skier. She loves skiing, which is really quite magical. And here's the interior. Now, just 10 years of this rich and productive career were spent working for Le Corbusier. And at the risk of perpetuating biases, as I said, I'm going to focus on this early period of her work, which includes this collaboration with Le Corbusier, which was very influential to both her and to him. Charlotte Perriand was born in Paris in 1903. The only child of a tailor and seamstress working in the fashion industry. They were working actually for an English company, Cumbernauld, doing evening wear. And her mother worked, which I think is an important detail for her formation. And unlike some of the other well-known women designers of the era, such as Eileen Gray, Lily Reich, and Sonia Delaunay, she grew up in relatively modest circumstances. She spent much of her youth in the countryside with a maternal great uncle, a peasant in Burgundy, and with her grandfather, a blacksmith in Savoy. And again, this experience in the countryside will be very important to her formation. Following the example of a maternal aunt, she entered a women's design school, the École de l'Union Centrale des Arts Décoratifs, as a scholarship student in 1920. It was actually in one of the wings of the Louvre, and there you see her, the one standing with the big smile. And here she was exposed to a variety of crafts, and the emphasis was on really hands-on experience designing decorative objects rather than theory. She also took what's going to work best. The sound keeps coming and going. Any ideas on how to help it? Is that better? Can they, it seems, but can they hear me on Zoom? Yes, okay. But does it work for people on Zoom is the question. Okay. If there are any problems, please let me know. I'm actually used to having to speak loudly in Colombia. But just tell me. Okay. She also, while she was studying at this women's decorative art school, she also took courses with two of the leading designers for department stores. And this is important. Paul Fillot, the director of Pomone, a department store in France, and Maurice Dufresne, who was in charge of the La Maîtrise workshop at the Galerie Lafayette. And here she learned about producing lower cost furnishings in serial runs and not just high luxury items. Although their designs were conventional and less progressive than those of several of their contemporaries, such as Rob Mellet-Stevens and Francis Jourdan, their designs were intended for middle-class clients and, as I said, serial production. And I'm intentionally using the word serial production rather than mass production because runs were usually, as with the Frankfurt Kitchen, 10 to 15 pieces at a time. Perrion's own early designs were like those of her teachers, were hardly innovative or original. In fact, they're kind of standard Art Deco pieces of the period. But what was unusual is how quickly she established herself as an independent designer. Already in 1925, she contributed designs, a wrought iron screen and fabric designs to the Exposition Internationale in Paris. And here you see one of the screens that she designed. And the following year, and I emphasize she's only 22, I'm kind of in awe of this, she presented a corner of a room, as it was called, at the Salon de Société des Artistes Décorateurs. The design is strikingly eclectic, a kind of confluence of dominant design strains of the day. And like many Art Deco designers, included rare woods, the chair, a table, and bookcase, for example, are in burl and boina, and Brazilian rosewood. Brazilian rosewood, by the way, was very much prized by Art Deco designers. While critics praised her ingenuity and taste, Raymond Ragami, a critic for the leading decorative arts magazine, Art de Décoration, criticized her awkward juxtapositions. And perhaps not surprisingly, given this kind of criticism, but also because she had her attention to what was happening elsewhere, Perrion's design work underwent a major transformation the following year. She began to use tubular steel. In 1927, she designed several metal tables, and for the Salon d'Automne, there are two major exhibitions in France in the 20s, one in the spring, which is the one she did the corner of the room, and the other in the fall, the Salon d'Automne. She created this display called the Bar in the Attic, which was based on her own studio apartment at Place Saint-Sulpice. With gleaming, aluminum and nickel-coated surfaces, glass shelves, and brightly colored leather cushions, it was a kind of witty synthesis of casual bohemianism and chic luxury. Even putting a bar in a living room was considered very avant-garde at that moment in time. And instead of the dark wallpaper of her 1926 exhibition, the walls were painted light pastel colors. All moldings were gone. What caused this dramatic change? As Perriand herself explained, Jean Fouquet, a modern jewelry designer, had lent her Le Corbusier's Vers in Architecture and Les Arts Décoratifs d'Aujourd'hui, the latter a vehement indictment of the 1925 Paris World's Fair. These books, she wrote, quote, opened the wall before my eyes. Like many of her generation, she was moved by the new mechanical inventions and the energy of the jazz age. And this is how she put it. Why this break? Probably because I express my own needs. I'm aware and in tune with my own age. It is mechanical. The cars in the street strike the eye. They are polished, shiny. I wear chrome beads around my neck, a belt of metal links. My studio is chromed steel, and I wear my hair a la Josephine Baker. Carry-on's association of female dress with innovation in the decorative arts was not unusual. For example, one critic, also contributed to Arte Decoration, wrote, "Women, for psychological reasons, are in love with the new, while men, in general, grimace at change." We should debate whether this is still true or not. I don't know. And impede as much as they can variations in fashion. And I'm jumping ahead, but Le Corbusier would say something nearly identical in his 1930 book, Précision, that I want to mention. This is 3 years later, and that interval will be very important. We'll come back to this quotation. And there you get an image of Perriand, the modern woman. But if at this moment Perriand's desire to be modern seems more about a certain sensibility and imagery, she soon wanted much more, and she was determined to work for Le Corbusier, who was committed to serial production and the creation of low-cost housing. Remember that the last chapter of Towards a New Architecture is called Mass-Produced Housing, and this really attracted her. Shortly before the bar installation, she had approached Le Corbusier about entering his atelier, and his oft-quoted response was hardly encouraging. "We don't embroider cushions in my studio." But something about this persistent young woman must have struck him, and he attended the Salon d'Automne, where she had her bar, and almost immediately offered her a place in the atelier. Others working there, and you see Le Corbusier on her side right there. Others working at Le Corbusier and Pierre's Genere's office included the Yugoslav Ernest Weissman, two Japanese, first Kunya Mayakawa, who's right next to her, and then a couple very shortly afterwards, Yunza Sakakura, who became a close friend, the Swiss architect Alfred Roth, and Le Corbusier's cousin and partner, Pierre Jeanneret. No one was paid, at least regularly. Perriand continued to work independently. In addition, she received support from her husband, a wealthy older Englishman who also paid for her architectural lessons with Alfred Roth, who was in the studio. And Roth taught her axonometric drawings, which was not something she would have learned in the decorative art school. In fact, a little anecdote, there were no axonometric drawings in Le Corbusier's office before 1927 until he hired Swiss like Alfred Roth to work on the League of Nations competition. But anyway, she quickly learned. She did this little sports room, and it was actually published in a magazine. During the 1920s, Le Corbusier had been categorically opposed to traditional notions of furniture. In L'Esprit Nouveau, he had written the advertisements for Roneo metal doors and innovation storage units, endorsed American-style office furniture in his captions, and published a series of articles decrying the contemporary arts. One reason he was so prejudiced originally against hiring Perriand. He believed that furniture should be regarded as, quote, equipment, that was the word he liked, functional, efficient, and standardized. The architect's role, as he declared, was to order and proportion, not to add. In other words, you should buy pieces off of the market, industrially produced ideally. It wasn't the architect who should be designing them. So why, in 1927, did Le Corbusier hire a furniture designer? Since the early 1920s, he had long sought to reform the domestic residence, making it simpler, easier to clean, and without the trappings of bourgeois pretension. In short, to spare women of household drudgery. And this is already clear in what he, part of, I don't know if you all read it, I actually provided a PDF of it, of his Manifesto of a Dwelling, published curiously in the section Airplanes in Towards a New Architecture. And this little manifesto, my voice seems to be going, sorry, was specifically addressed to women. Initially, one of his solutions was to this problem of household drudgery, and he used the word drudgery, like others of the period did, really seeing women, especially those without servants, as kind of household slaves. And his initial solution was the immeuble villa, a kind of mixture of private residences and collective amenities, such as cooperative laundries, restaurants, and daycare facilities or childcare facilities. And it was probably inspired, it may have been by Fourier, whom he mentions in one or two books, Phalansterie. And it's also remarkably similar, we don't know if he knew, to proposals for the American apartment hotels that were being built at the early 20th century, and inspired in part, at least some of them, by the work of an American feminist that he probably didn't know, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Although this goal of a freer, more meaningful domestic life would remain a constant in Le Corbusier's thought and work, his ideas about how to achieve this changed in the late 1920s. It seemed that the experience of the Werkbund exhibition Die Wohnung on dwelling and the design of his two houses at the Weissenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart marked a turning point in his thinking, one that I believe was fundamental to his hiring of Charlotte Perriand. And I think there were three factors or developments so visible in the experimental housing community, this exhibition, Die Wohnung, that were critical, suggesting for him new visual sensibilities and new images of modernity. First, tubular steel furniture design. Second, what I talked about last week, the domestic reform movement. And third, the increasing prominence of women designers. And they were very prominent in Germany at this moment in time. Furniture. By 1927, it must have been increasingly clear to Le Corbusier that his earlier Losian opposition to architecture design furniture was untenable. The market, traditionally conservative in France, had failed to generate, in his view, appropriate industrial prototypes. His appel aux industriels, his call to industrialists to make prefabricated housing units, prefabricated furniture, had clearly failed. At the Weissenhof Siedlung exhibits, he couldn't help but be aware of the new tubular steel chairs produced by Marcel Breuer and Mies van der Rohe, which were on prominent display throughout the exhibition. The humble Thonet bentwood chairs, oh, here's another example. Even Gropius would use Mies van der Rohe's chairs and Marcel Breuer's chairs in his own exhibitions. And Corbu's own chairs like the Sonnet chair next to the table or his imitation British club chairs, must have looked quaint and somewhat outmoded to him against these overtly mechanistic designs. So only 2 years early, this is what his furniture looked like in the Esprit Nouveau Pavilion. This question of metal furniture must have come to a head for Le Corbusier while he and Jeanneret designed their 2 model houses for Stuttgart. As Alfred Roth, who was in charge of supervising construction and finishing the interiors, reported, Le Corbusier kept promising him drawings of furniture pieces, but just didn't deliver. He had larger issues on his mind in 1927, namely the fiasco surrounding the League of Nations competition. Roth ended out designing quickly and with extremely limited resources the tubular steel beds and tables. And as you can see, they are extremely austere and undoubtedly too sachlich, a word hard to translate, but too rational, too utilitarian for even Le Corbusier's own taste. And few critics admired the results. So the furniture there certainly must have shook him up a little. The second feature I'll go over very quickly, domestic reform, because I talked about it earlier, but it must have, this exhibition, alerted him to studies of household rationalization and what was going on in Germany at the time. Throughout the 1920s, Le Corbusier had been an active proponent of Taylorism and scientific management. And here are some brochures he published showing his Stuttgart houses and how he was a proponent of standardization. But we had no evidence that before the exhibition, he had tried to apply these principles to domestic planning before the Stuttgart show. There, it must have been impossible for him not to acknowledge their prominent role. German women reformers, following the precedents of the names I mentioned last week, Mary Patterson and Christine Frederick, actively campaigned to professionalize housework and sought collaborations with architects to further their ideals. I'll skip over these, but one of the most prominent, as I mentioned, was Erna Meyer, and also on display at the fair, as I showed earlier, were Erna Meyer's designs with Aud and Hilda Zimmerman, who were displayed at the exhibition. Le Corbusier himself was severely criticized for the inefficiency of his own kitchens at the Weissenhof settlement. On viewing his houses, Erna Meyer reported to Mies van der Rohe, and I should just mention, Erna Meyer was hired by Mies to consult on the interiors of Weissenhof, so she had a very prominent role at the fair. And this is what she said about Corbu's kitchens, which you can see in the drawings. I am disappointed by Le Corbusier most of all. What happened to all the principles in his book? Is this what he means by the engineer's aesthetic? Mies responded, he found Le Corbusier's designs, and I'm quoting, exceptionally charming and fabulously French. And I don't know whether it would be very perverse to make a point of this specifically French character. In other words, not very functional. But despite defenses like this, Le Corbusier was apparently not willing to be quite that French. It may have been remarks like this that prompted him to hire a specialist in domestic interiors and furniture design shortly after the exhibition, that is, Charlotte Perriand, later that fall. In Germany, He also saw and was extremely impressed with Ernst May's Frankfurt housing, which was famous for that kitchen you've already seen numerous times by Gertrude Lohotsky, which was so famous in the late 20s. Her kitchen was displayed at Stuttgart alongside Mitropa's Pullman-style kitchen for trains. Third, women designers that were active in the exhibition. Third, the presence of women designers at the Werkbund exposition, if still relatively modest, could also not be ignored. Besides Meyer, Zimmerman's, and Schut-Lohotsky's kitchens, Lily Reich's designs were a prominent presence. She was responsible for most of the exhibitions in the central exhibition hall at the fair, including the ones for industrial products and model kitchens. And here's her installation for the German Linoleum Works. And in my first lecture, I could have added another category, or in my other lectures, of how women influence the modern movement. But one of those categories is, without a question, exhibition design, where Lily Reich was really quite brilliant. She also designed one of the apartments in Mises' large housing block, and assisted Mies with the furnishings of his own model apartment. He hardly did any interiors in this period without Lily Reich's own help, and she was so fundamental for giving them a certain kind of elegance and color. These women designers defied Le Corbusier's earlier stereotype of French women in the decorative arts, described in the pages of L'Art Décoratif d'aujourd'hui. And here's a quote that summarizes his assumptions at the time, where he argued that decorative arts needed, and I'm using his word, male attributes: organization, unity, balance, preparation, etc. Words that he didn't associate at that time when he wrote the book in 25 with women. However, it should also be recognized, as I tried to imply last week, that the situation in France also began to change. By 1927, tubular steel furniture had begun to be regularly displayed in the salon, and modernist women designers were increasingly prominent, including Eileen Gray, Adrienne Gorska, Charlotte Elix, Lucy Holt-Lasson, and Sonia Delaunay. And finally, again, a domestic reform movement was gaining currency. France had been much slower than Germany and the Netherlands to take up the cause of the tailorized home. And when I use the word tailorized or Taylorism, I'm referring to the American industrial engineer Taylor, who already in the late 1880s had proposed reorganizing industrial plants to improve efficiency and work. Besides a general reluctance to introduce American industrial methods, and this is despite the U.S.'s help in France with World War I, this delay was due in part to the traditional reliance on household servants, and in part because there was no clear alliance between architecture and domestic reform as there had been in Germany. And one of the things I actually hope we can discuss is how the longer reliance in middle-class households in Brazil on servants affected these issues as well, and influenced things like kitchen design and apartment design more generally. I was shocked, actually, when I saw a housing complex, this is a little aside, in Rio by Roberto, the Roberto brothers early, which had this elaborate dual circulation system for servants and regular public visitors. And I just can't even imagine such a thing existing in the US, even at the beginning of the century. So there are really important cultural differences that I think we have to explore. But back to my topic. In France, as I alluded to last week, it was slow to take off, although Christine Frederick's book was translated early on, and individuals like Henriette Cavaignac and the technocrat Jules Louis Breton had long promoted the rationalized home, really since about 1920. It was not until the late 1920s that the movement gained momentum. In 1926, the former Salon des Appareils Ménagers, in other words, the Salon of Appliances, which displayed modern appliances and model houses, got renamed the Salon des Arts Ménagers, a rather more poetic title, and moved to the Grand Palais, where it was a major success, seen by thousands in France. In 1927, Dunod released a second edition of Frederick's book. And note now the word moderne in the title. So domestic reform was now very much associated with modernity in France. And in 1928, as I referred to last week, and I won't go over this again, Paulette Berneige, who was a philosophy student, and had helped organize the exhibition, published her two books that I referred to last week with those cartoons. There. One of her major points was that the modern residence entailed an interactive relationship between housewives, architects, engineers, and manufacturers. And as I said earlier, she alluded to the importance of Le Corbusier's ideas on standardized construction and wanted to extend the same principles to running to the household. It seems like her influence and Stuttgart all led Le Corbusier to reverse his earlier position on architect-designed furniture, the rationalized household, and women's role in the decorative arts. And most important for my purposes today, reverse his earlier decision about hiring Charlotte Perriand. There you see her ball-bearing necklace that she was so proud of wearing at the time. I can't imagine how heavy it must have been, but she wore it. Anyway, he was impressed by her talent, her youthful energy, and realized that her training in furniture and the decorative arts would bring a certain expertise to the office that it sorely needed, and that was clear after Alfred Roth's furniture. And I suspect, this is pure speculation, that he was charmed as well by this young woman who seemed to embody la femme moderne. And here she is with Alfred Roth, the man who taught her drawing, and they remained good buddies. Later, another anecdote, I interviewed Alfred Roth while he was still alive, and he started telling me all sorts of stories about Charlotte. And then he got a little worried, and he called her up and asked if he could tell them to me. She said no. It was a lot of good gossip, but I didn't get to hear it. Although others gave me snippets. Okay. Before turning to her contributions to Le Corbusier and Pierre's atelier, I would like to look briefly at a project that she completed on her own shortly after her employment. She was working on it while she began working for Le Corbusier. And that is the dining room that I showed earlier that she displayed at the Salon des Artistes Décorateurs in the spring of 1928. This room was part of a collaborative exhibit with two other young interior designers, Joe Bourgeois, who displayed a spacious double-height living room. And by the way, the French like to use the English word living room to suggest a more modern, kind of relaxed way of living than salon. A kitchen with a decidedly clinical air, white enameled fixtures, a laboratory stool, and a naked light bulb. And this, too, was a kind of radical gesture in the salon culture and probably influenced Le Corbusier and Perriand herself. And René Herbst, a smoking room, the most playful of the three rooms. Perriand's dining room struck a happy compromise between her two colleagues' displays. It was at once functional and, in my view, elegant, original without being too bohemian, and the predictable chicness of her 1927 bar had disappeared in this confident vision of modern life. The room featured an extendable dining table placed against one wall, 4 swivel dining chairs, a long buffet with 3 sliding glass panels, you don't see it here, but you will later, as well as a small round table with swivel stools against a glass wall, recalling again her own atelier. She used her own apartment as a kind of laboratory for her displays. Potted trees, vases of flowers, a wicker basket, a bowl of fruit, and an African mask provided lyrical counterpoints to the clean, hard surfaces. With this exhibit, Perriand began to define more assertively her concept of the modern interior. Although functionalism had always been part of her decorative arts training, it now took on a more visible and certainly more polemical edge. The table's black rubber surface and terrazzo-leaf floor, I don't know exactly what that is, but it's a kind of early version of sheet linoleum, minimized cleaning. It was to be a room without servants. The built-in buffet provided storage for dishes, which minimized clutter, and the shelf above the table accommodated wine and serving platters, facilitating, as critics noted at the time, service in the servantless household. Her furniture designs were more emphatically industrial in their aesthetic than they were earlier. They were lighter and could readily be moved. But they also did not preclude comfort or even humor. This is apparent, I think, in the swivel dining chair. In French, it was called siège tournant, which was inspired by the office desk chair, like these, but the 20s version. And this almost, for me, creature-like chair with its plump, bright coral-colored round cushions vaguely suggested a Michelin man propped up on 4 spiderly legs. But just as important as the new imagery proposed by Perriand and her collaborators was the social objective of the space. In the middle of the road journal, L'Architecture, it was not an avant-garde journal, it published everything. The critic Pierre Omer labeled the group's efforts extreme left, noting their audacity in confronting future conditions. Almost all critics noted that the design responded to the needs of contemporary life, namely the servantless households that dispensed with bourgeois conventions. One of the most notable reviews was by Marcel Bellatoire in the English magazine Studio. He wrote, "Perhaps never before have I so definitively experienced the feeling of entering a new world, or breaking down with narrow traditions of a window open to the future. I think I gave you a brief quote of this before. The motor car, the airplane, and wireless, that's the radio, have in a few years revolutionized, and his word is revolutionized, the material conditions of life. Grave social questions, home life, housing, the position of women have altered our customs. At this time, the artists have not remained outside the movement. They have progressed with it, and sometimes even gone beyond it. The idea, in other words, that art and architecture might even lead in social reform is what he's proposing. The project was also widely praised in the sort of commercial women's magazines of the period. In one called Maison pour Tout, Households for Everyone, for example, the critic described the project as a solution for, quote, active, sportive existence. It was clear that this was a space to be used by the femme moderne, one who fully embraced a revolution in lifestyle. Although the assumption of critics and the French public at large was still that women were the mistresses of the house, the possibility that these women might also work, engage in sports, and have busy, active lives was now embodied in Perrion's striking installation. This image of modern living was one that Perrion would continue to develop in her next major installation, this done under the firm's name, that is, Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret, but one done without any major input from Le Corbusier, that is, the Salon d'Automne in 1929. Excuse me. With her background in the decorative arts, one of the first tasks that Le Corbusier had given Perrion when she entered the office was to develop a series of furniture pieces, an assignment that resulted in the 3 tubular steel chairs for which the firm is famous. Le Corbusier had proclaimed the chair a machine for sitting, but he had stressed that such machines could accommodate different body positions necessary for different tasks, such as work dining, conversation, lecturing, and relaxing. And Perrion did studies using these basic little models to try to figure out what the best chairs might be. And they settled on 3 to begin with. Perrion described the creative relationship between Le Corbusier, Pierre Jeanneret, and herself as being like 3 fingers on one hand. She credited Le Corbusier for setting the design parameters, the idea that we need different chairs for different positions. She worked out with Jeanneret the designs and full-scale details, and then she took charge of the execution herself, fabricating the first prototypes in her own studio apartment. In 1932, Le Corbusier credited Perrion for having, and I quote, the sole responsibility for the execution of all our domestic equipment. He also said the same in his 1930 book, Précision. And over the years, contrary to some assertions, he regularly acknowledged her role in the firm's work. Another discussion might be why she wasn't credited until recently. But he himself, and I would like to stress this because sometimes he gets accused, not always unfairly, but in this case unfairly, for not crediting her. From her sketches, it's clear that she had a seminal role in their design. The first chair that Perrion developed for the firm was the siège à dossier basculant, chair with a swinging back, which was intended for living room conversation. And basically, it's a reworking of the colonial or British officer's chair with tubular steel legs. I think there's actually one of the famous Brazilian chairs also is inspired by this same basic model with leather sling arms. But anyway, her version had tubular steel legs, replacing wooden legs of the officer's chair, and its arm straps were now tightly sprung with metal coils. While the frame would remain standard, Perriand envisioned that the fabrics might vary on the setting or a client's preference, or even the season. In its separation of structure and body support, in its lightness and mechanistic aesthetic, the chair also recalled Breuer's 1925 Vasily chair. But I think there were notable differences in scale and elaboration. The dimensions of, for me at least, of the siège dossier masculin suggest a female occupant or a slender man, while it's easy to imagine a big executive sitting in Breuer's wider, more mannered model, as you saw in my earlier image. In contrast, the fauteuil Grand Confort, or the firm's version of an easy chair, was to be a machine for relaxing. Squat and plush, it was a modern translation of the overstuffed easy chair in a club or gentleman's library. It consisted of 5 bulging leather cushions, secured, indeed squeezed, by a tubular steel frame. This innovative design, with its exposed frame, inverted the usual relationship between frame and upholstery in traditional easy chairs, while still offering the essence of luxurious comfort. In other words, usually we have the frame hidden in an easy chair. Now it's exposed. The chair was made in 2 sizes, suggesting that both men and women in a wide range of body types could enjoy its enveloping pleasures. And there's debates about whether the big was for the man, the small for the woman. Ken Frampton actually argues that the big one allowed women to put their legs up on the chair. Who knows? But you had your choice. None of the soft-leg German or Eastern European designers, in my view, had yet successfully dealt with the issue of comfort. Breuer had called the Vasily a club chair, but unlike the partnerships model, it was not a chair anyone would want to curl up in. You tend to put your legs down if you sit in Breuer's Vasily chair. With the serpentine chaise longue, Perriand addressed another issue of relaxation, and these are her sketches, not Le Corbusier's. The lounge chair permitted different reclining positions, with the weight of the human body fixing the chosen angle of inclination. And since its inception, it has been widely praised for its comfort. Although I don't know how many people actually sit on it. They like to use it almost like a piece of sculpture in their living rooms. But it is quite comfortable if you can lie down for a while. Its precedents included bentwood rocking chairs. Oh, I should go back. Invalid chairs. Someone named Dr. Pascoe's patented circuit pole. The Morris lounge chair, that's the, and ocean liner deck chairs. And fundamental to the chair's sensuous quality, I would propose the earlier Duchesse or Duchesse Brisée. 18th century grace and eroticism have their 20th century equivalent in this light, undulating structure poised on 4 points, so beautifully illustrated by the classic image of Perriand relaxing on its stretched canvas surface. Paradoxically, both Perriand and Le Corbusier mentioned a man in their descriptions of the chair's creation. Perriand explained that she thought of a simple soldier who, when he is tired, lies down on his back, puts his feet up against a tree with his knapsack under his head. And Le Corbusier imagined, quote, a cowboy from the Wild West smoking his pipe, his feet in the air, higher than his head, against the chimney piece. And I'm quoting him, complete rest. Nevertheless, the image that each chose to illustrate this chaise longue in use in their respective accounts of the furniture was this iconic photograph of Perriand, evoking the chair's seductive charm, which belies, I think, the purported neutrality of the machine aesthetic. And I'm going to add a little anecdote in contrast to one feminist scholar's account who tried to analyzed it rather curiously, saying that Corbu set up the photo and was denying Perriand authorship. Perriand got furious. She was really upset by that because she said the photo was taken when Corbu was in South America, lecturing in Brazil and Argentina. She set up the photograph and Pierre Jeanneret took it. And she turned her head, she claimed, to not emphasize herself. There may have been a coquettish dimension to it, who knows, but it was definitely her photograph, her intention to display it this way. The abandonment of traditional masculine or feminine chair types was, in fact, I would propose, one of modern furniture's most radical breaks with precedent. As late as the spring of 1927, Le Corbusier was still distinguishing between male and female furnishings. But by 1928, after Perriand's arrival, those distinctions had disappeared. Because tubular steel combined such traditional male and female attributes as strength and lightness, straight lines and curves, the differences between a man's chair and a woman's chair no longer seemed relevant. Modernism's elimination of figurative imagery also reduced, I would suggest, references to gender, leaving scale, color, and setting as the primary variables in design. Later, Breuer's and Mies's metal furniture would gain connotations of a masculine corporate world, in part due to their use in office settings, at least in the US. However, the chairs by Perriand, Le Corbusier, and Jeanneret, with their smaller scale, humorous touches, mixture of natural and industrial materials, and imagery of relaxation, have largely escaped these associations. Although in the late 1920s, French critics had begun to question gender distinctions in furniture design, Perriand herself made no allusions to gender in her own writings about furniture. In her 1929 essay, I showed you this image earlier, A Passionate Defense of Metal Furniture, she mentioned sports, automobiles, airplanes, the man of the 20th century, but not the woman of the 20th century. However, in the context of the conservative French post-World War I milieu, the very rejection of clear gender stereotypes was in itself probably understood as a challenge to bourgeois conventions and women's traditional role in the home. I'm going to ask a question right now. I have probably another 15, 20 minutes. Is it better to take a break or should I finish the talk? What do you think? Yeah. What do you think? Break. Okay. Yeah. 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 Why don't we take a break? I'll finish the talk. It's about 15 or 20 minutes more, and then we can have a general discussion. Okay? Yeah. We started late, but you probably could use a little coffee or sugar. Okay. I think Gila brought some goodies. I know this is taxing to hear, even though I'm pretty good in French, when I hear lectures in French, I get worn out. So I can imagine it's not easy. Okay. Um, I'm going to now turn to this 1929 exhibition she did, which I think even shows more than her 1928 display, this challenge to bourgeois conventions and women's traditional role in the home. It's also a showcase for the 3 new chairs that she designed with some input from Corbu and more input from Pierre Jeanneret, but mostly herself. This exhibition, and you're seeing an image here, she also included her swivel dining chair that she designed on her own. I asked her, by the way, about how she felt about using her own pieces with Corbu displays, and she said, of course I was happy. We saw it as a collaborative effort, and I think that's one of the things one has to understand, and it might be why some of these women disappeared from the historical record. Collaboration was such a major, major part of the modern movement. And we forget that because we put people like Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius as some sort of high level, but it was really seen as a group kind of endeavor. But back to the talk. Okay. They called this exhibition, you see a picture here, equipment, using that word Corbu liked better than furniture, equipment for a dwelling. And it included, besides the 3 chairs, the so-called airplane table based on the struts of a biplane that are the form of the legs, and Perrion's own swivel tubular steel chairs, which were intended, as you see, for dining. Another important feature were the built-in cassier, or storage cabinets. Earlier in you see them in this 1928 exhibition that she did for Corbu, the interior of the church residence at Ville d'Avray. And she was largely responsible for this interior, which also uses the airplane table. But like that project, her own studio apartment on Saint-Sulpice, and her independent installation at the 1928 Société des Artistes Décorateurs. The 1929 display, as I just mentioned, was much more than a showcase for furniture. It presented a whole image of modern life, or modern living, no longer an eclectic, if charming. Are things working out? Or is it... Oh, excuse us.
They're not seeing you, but
it doesn't matter if they don't see me, if they see the images.
Eu queria saber se está realmente filmando. Então, aquela tela que aparece, ela não é essencial para filmar, para nada.
It's okay? Are they seeing the images? They don't need to see me until the discussion. It's okay. In fact, I prefer not to be seen. Okay.
No italiano, we are without audio. They are not listening. Oh my God.
Is the mic on? Is this on?
Esse áudio aqui está desligado porque está ligado esse, né? Acho que tem que ligar esse aí.
Is it working now?
That's why something was wrong.
Okay. Okay, should we try again?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's right. Okay. Anyway, as I said, it was much more than just displaying furniture pieces. It was supposed to project a dazzling new kind of living space that again broke with those French traditions and stuffy bourgeois life. Metal and glass were everywhere. The facade consisted of a long strip window of sliding glass panels with a band of Nevada glass blocks or bricks below. The floor was thick glass slabs. The ceiling in the service zone over on the side here was etched glass with the lighting behind it. And the bathroom tiles were transparent blue glass. And the effect, I think, must have been quite spectacular. Even, do you need to adjust?
Just to see you, but they are listening. Okay.
But am I blocking the images?
Yes.
Yeah. I have to trust them. Okay. But anyway, I think it must have been quite spectacular. Just all this shining metal and glass. Even in contrast, I don't know if you all know Pierre Charot's Maison de Verre in Paris. I think even compared to that, this was like this glittering, amazing display, if you think about in contrast to Art Deco interiors. The final design and installation were done when Le Corbusier, as I said earlier, was traveling in South America. And there's no question that Perriand, working with Jeanneret, was largely responsible for its appearance and arrangement of the apartment. And there you see the layout of the plan in her scribble form. That sketch is by her, and then a reconstructed drawing that the wonderful architectural historian Arthur Rueg did. Her hand is perhaps most evident in the kitchen. So we're going back to kitchens, my obsession again, which was undoubtedly inspired both by the domestic reform movement that I mentioned, but also in her case, by her love of entertaining and practical experience. She loved having friends over, and talking while she was cooking was part of her joy. While not at this stage active in the Salon des Arts Ménagers, she regularly attended its yearly displays and was familiar with Breton and Bernege's efforts. But it must also be noted that her model kitchen, with its polished chrome and shimmering surfaces, differed distinctly from the modest kitchen designs, German ones, including Schutt-Lahotzky's renowned Frankfurt kitchen, where production and cost were major determinants. And probably that one was more practical. Perriand's kitchen was meant to be appreciated on both practical and aesthetic grounds. In contrast to Le Corbusier and Jeanneret's earlier service spaces, which were clearly intended for maids, it was extensively photographed, published, including in the second volume of the Oeuvre Complète, and widely praised in both the architectural and women's press. A critic in L'Architecture called the kitchen a perfect success, citing the apartment's rigor and commenting that everything was done to make life easier. He went on to say that, quote, the kitchen, where all is studied, organized, and mechanized, will delight and fill with pleasure the most exacting and scientific of housewives. Of course, the assumption is that women will still cook, and probably to fantasize anything else would have been complete utopia at that moment in time. But I want to just underscore the words exacting and scientific, which had to do with my earlier assertion that gender associations were being challenged, the idea that housewives could be scientific. One of the most enthusiastic reviews of the In fact, appeared in Paulette Bernèche's magazine, Mon Chez Moi. And as the editor, she undoubtedly made the decision to feature the kitchen on the magazine's cover. An anonymous critic, who probably was Bernèche, marveled in her review. The kitchen is pretty, it is ingenious, and so remarkable, so rich in new ideas, and so practical. And none of this highly chromed surfaces, of course, appeared in the Frankfurt kitchen. One of my favorite details is her placement of the cabbage as decoration on the counter. But as these remarks show, Le Corbusier, Jeanneret, and Perriand were never quite as insistent on pure functionalism as some of their critics claimed, and admittedly as some of their oft-quoted aphorisms implied. For Perriand, like Le Corbusier, functionalism never precluded lyricism, beauty, or wit, and larger representational goals. The salon was meant to convey, once more, a new vision of domestic life, one that reduced household labor and offered more freedom, dispensing once more with those staid French conventions, social conventions, class pretensions, and gender divisions. For the partners, this meant dissolving the boundaries between private and public spaces. Note the pass-through window from the kitchen to the dining room, something that was completely rare in most middle-class French residences at the time. It wasn't rare, actually, in the U.S. I lived in a Boston apartment that had a pass-through window that was done in 1910, but in France, it was rare. And even more radical, this is quite astonishing, the conspicuously open bathing area. Notice how you can kind of see everything. Anyone sitting in the living room, and here's another view. By the way, there's a bidet, but I couldn't find a toilet in the design, so we didn't go quite that far. Anyway, anyone sitting in the living room, well, before I finish, do you have any idea what that cylinder is? I asked before. What? The cylinder behind the shelving? Shower, yeah. So if you're sitting in the living room in that nice Grand Confort chair, what do you see? A guest or a member of the family, the couple, walking in and out, their bare feet and their wet hair out of the shower. So we were breaking with conventions. Perriand, it was an aluminum-clad conical shower. Perriand herself admitted to me that it would have been too much for most middle-class and working-class potential residents. She also acknowledged when I interviewed her that the furnishings and fittings of the apartment, including the kitchen appliances, were too expensive for the very people she hoped to be designing for. This, however, was not a concern for the critics, used to the luxurious displays at the Paris Salon. They were almost unanimous, celebratory in their praise. In Art et Décoration, someone named Marc Ternier declared it, quote, a manifesto, a declaration of war on the ideal of the padded and stuffed bourgeois salon. Like the furnishings, it promised a more functional, flexible, and gracious form of domesticity that might appeal to the new woman, if one that was too expensive and extreme in its aesthetic for most middle-class and working-class people. But I'd like to propose that it was probably in its representational role that the exhibition and three chairs had their greatest impact. They presented a seductive image of modernity, which more than anything embodied what Perriand called, and I'm quoting, joy of creating and living in this century of ours. She wanted somehow to make life easier, more joyful, more relaxed, just a different thing than the kind of world that most French people, certainly middle-class people and women, lived in. In many regards, the Salon d'Automne exhibit, though, was a one-off creation. I can think of no other interior by the firm that was as rigorously mechanistic in its imagery or as insistent on one unified aesthetic. One might see the installation as a culmination of Le Corbusier's machine aesthetic in the 20s, one that Perriand fully embraced in her 1929 polemic wood or metal that I showed earlier, and they were done at the same time. But if the imagery would change, and I will return to that in my conclusion, I would like to suggest that at least in one fundamental way, the Salon, and by extension Perriand and domestic reformers like Bernays, represented an important change in Le Corbusier's approach to domestic interior. And that's what I actually tried to underscore last week, that Corbu now had a new attention to service spaces, especially kitchens. No longer were kitchens or baths or the details of domestic equipment seen too lowly for the master's attention. He now published them regularly. And the first one he publishes, although not in the Oeuvre Complète, is Garches, which Perriand probably worked on, although we have no proof when she first got in the office. And the second one he publishes is a full-page photo, which I showed you quickly last week, of Villa Savoie, which Perriand designed the kitchen. And for me, Le Corbusier's caption is telling. In English, it's the kitchen is not exactly the sanctuary of the house, but it is certainly one of the most important spaces. Kitchen and salon, those are the spaces where one lives, not just the servants. We know, too, that Le Corbusier explicitly asked Perriand to design the kitchen for his own new apartment, where his wife, Yvonne, and there she is, in pants no less, being very much a femme moderne, loved to cook. The kitchen was the one room in the house where rationalization and efficiency governed. Besides the tubular steel furniture, it was probably the most explicit legacy of the 1929 Salon exhibition. However, the influence of women, undoubtedly especially Perriand, translated this new era, this new arena of rationalization. Most of all, they represented for Le Corbusier a new modern, a more relaxed, informal way of living. As this illustration, again I'm repeating an image, but now larger, published in La Ville Radieuse, 1935, so beautifully illustrates. Beneath the sketch, he wrote, "This picture, taken from a woman's magazine, suggests new social customs, an escape from hypocrisy and certain conventions." And notice the kitchen is totally open to the dining area, which just would not have happened in most French homes, unless you're working class or a peasant at that moment in time. But as I mentioned before, in other ways, the salon might be seen as a conclusion, at least aesthetically, in its explicit avant-garde posture of a certain vision of modernity. It would seem, in some ways, it had become increasingly at odds with both Perriand and Le Corbusier's commitment to liberated living, including Le Corbusier's Losian assertion that only built-in furnishings should remain within the architect's control. And I always love this image, which also appears in La Villeperdier's What Kind of Environment is Le Corbusier Living in the 20s? This is his first house on Rue Jacob, absolutely cluttered with all of his possessions. He was a collector almost as much as Burle Marx, who organized his better. And he was covered with papers and objects in his little left bank apartment. Certainly, the Salon exhibition was not the model of the furnished living area of Villa Savoie, where once again we see club chairs and not any of the 3 new tubular steel chairs, which apparently Madame Savoie did not appreciate. And Le Corbusier, unlike Mies van der Rohe, was actually much more flexible with his clients. He did not have to control where everything was placed. If you know Tugendhat House by Mies, you cannot move the dining table. Really, everything is set in one place. And Frank Lloyd Wright was even worse. But even more indicative of Le Corbusier and Perrion's hesitation to embrace fully a machine-age Gesamtkunstwerk, or a total way of living, artwork, is the fact that neither of their new personal dwellings, they both moved in their 30s. His penthouse at Port Molitor, there you see an image of the atelier with some old chairs from his earlier life. Or this image of the apartment where he's bought a straw chair, probably from BHV, an apartment store in Paris. Nothing to do with that hardcore mechanistic aesthetic of the salon. And Perrion's own studio apartment after her divorce from a rather prosperous English husband, where you see again simple wooden chairs as well as the prototype of the Grand Comfort, which apparently Zonet would not reproduce. It was too expensive. And then later she designs this very simple wooden pine table that she includes in her own place. If anything, these very lived-in spaces might be seen, like the earlier Esprit Nouveau pavilion, as eclectic montages, but now including humble wood and straw furnishings. In the case of Perrion's Montparnasse small studio space, existing alongside this one piece of furniture that they couldn't sell. Just as telling might be the approach Perrion de Le Corbusier took at 2 public exhibitions that followed, the first in Cologne, 1931, and the second, Brussels, 1935. Shortly after the Salon installation, the office was invited to participate in an exhibition of interior design at this interiors fair at Cologne. Originally, the partners were going to display a minimal living unit of 14 meters square, but failed to get funding. Let's see, do I have it? No. They opted instead to install a modest display featuring the chaise longue, the siège à basculant, and Perrion's own pivoting chair, as well as a diorama of the 1925 urban plan Voisin. But the radical and most outrageous move was the carpet. Do any of you have any idea what that carpet is made of? What does it look like? What? It does, but it's not real. Anyway, they were cheap tourist rugs sold at the sidewalk of a cafe that Corbu thought were very funny, and he and Pierre bought them for nothing, and Charlotte sewed it together and made her own arrangement. And there was absolutely nothing modern about it. Yellow tigers on a bright blue background, tigers on a red field, an image of the Tour Eiffel, an angry lady, all of it playful, gaudy, really gaudy, kitsch-like. And Perriand explained that it was intended to startle the Sachlik, or these overly functional German designers. And this totally confused the organizers. And it was even more confusing to them when they decided, Perriand, Corbu, and Pierre, to insure it for an outrageous sum of money. And by the way, this rug ended out in Le Corbusier's own personal bedroom. This joke was prompted by Gropius and Breuer's Werkbund exhibit at the 1930 Salon des Artistes Décorateurs, which in Perriand and Le Corbusier's view, and here it is, lacked the spirit and pleasure that they associated with modernity. They always thought it should be fun and enjoyable and not just hardcore functionalism. But one might also see it as a comment on the totalizing vision of mechanistic modernity presented at the Salon d'Automne just 2 years earlier. Even if it contained a few playful notes of counterpoint, like I mentioned, the big cabbage that sat on the kitchen counter. Here you see another image of the rug and the furniture and Plan Voisin in the background. In 1935, Perriand publicly broke her own commandment, if you will, stated so categorically in her 1929 polemic, Wood or Metal, in a display the atelier presented at the Brussels World's Fair. In this exhibit, titled A Study for a Young Man, we see not only her own pivoting stool, I don't think you see it in this image, but maybe in another, chair, but also a heavy metal table, a heavy table made of slate, quite different from the airplane table, with a cast iron base, metal shelves displaying whale bones and pieces of flint, a map of the moon, and most surprising, a new chair for conversation. That's the wooden chair right there by the table, with wooden supports and straw seating, hand fabricated by a prison inmate. Here's a later model of that exact chair. Pierre Chiraud, the designer of Maison de Verre, and the director in the French section of the World's Fair, was really disturbed by the inclusion of this chair. But José Louis Sert, on seeing it, and he was, by the way, a good friend of Perriand's, proclaimed with delight, "C'est Charlotte." In the 1935 exhibit, like Le Corbusier and Charlotte's own houses, and unlike the 1929 apartment, do we have an issue? Are things okay? Okay. It was, in short, a melange of objects. And in Perriand's word, and I'm quoting her, it expressed a wide range of vocabularies and viewpoints. She proudly declared it, quote, free from constraints. In other words, it's a kind of pluralistic montage again. None of that hardcore total design that we saw at the Salon d'Automne. The Brussels installation signaled, I think, a more fundamental change in both Perriand and Le Corbusier's design in the early 1930s, one that embraced natural materials and rustic forms. The double imagery of classicism in the machine, so evident in Bergson architecture, had given way to one that embraced nature, peasants, and a general back to the land ethos. And these are images from a magazine that Le Corbusier co-edited in the early 30s, Plan. The stock market crash, France's own ensuing depression, and the rise of Nazism had all challenged dreams of industrial utopia so pervasive in the 1920s. And there another image from Corbusier magazine, an American cartoon, and an image from a French magazine showing the poverty of the period. And these are images representing, obviously, Mussolini's crowds and Hitler that were also published in the same magazine that Le Corbusier co-edited, Plan. And these events touched Perriand deeply, challenging dreams of industrial utopia so pervasive for both her and Le Corbusier in the 20s. She joined something called the Association of Revolutionary Writers and Arts, basically a communist organization, although she did not join the party, took classes in Marxism at the Workers' University, definitely a communist organization, and became active with the painter Fernand Léger, Pierre Jeanneret, and some of the younger members of the Atelier, such as František Sommer in the battle against fascism. Most of the Atelier was decidedly left. Le Corbusier's own politics are much more difficult to put your fingers on. Populism and accessibility were now more important to her than the symbolic expression of machine production. And at this moment, her political and artistic position was perhaps closest to Léger. It is probably not coincidental that he chose her 1935 wood and straw chair, the one made by a former prison convict, for almost nothing, for his own living room. Well, there's not time here to show the range of her work in the 30s, nor that in her long and rich career that followed. And I just gave a hint of that at the beginning of the talk. A few projects perhaps will suggest her new commitment to a vision of what I'm calling liberated living. Not just for the privileged or privileged bohemian artistic elite, but one that would extend genuinely to all. I'm sorry, my voice keeps going. Yeah. In Le Corbusier's office, yeah? No, it's okay. It's okay. I don't know why it keeps going. I have allergies and they're acting up. Okay. In Le Corbusier's office, much of her work focused, as I mentioned in the housing section on last Wednesday's lecture, on units for mass housing, as well as for the units in Le Corbusier's ideal project, La Ville Radieuse. And perhaps paradoxically, the guest bedroom of the Salon d'Automne now became the Atelier's model at the 1930 Brussels Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, or CM Congress, of the minimal housing unit. But for Perriand, this social commitment and desire to design for the greatest number, and I'm using a phrase that she and many other modern architects would use post-World War II, but it was already a commitment in the 30s, is perhaps most evident in her independent work done while still working for Le Corbusier and Jeanneret's Atelier, and she always had work on the side. She wrote for popular women's magazines such as Vendredi, where she gave advice about household furnishings, suggesting how to combine old family pieces with a few new inexpensive but well-made ones, and also explaining, as she did in this drawing, the advantage of built-in storage and storage units that you could combine, that word cassier that she and Corbu used. She entered competitions with designs for inexpensive vacation houses, anticipating the paid vacations of the Popular Front, which came into power in 1936. And most of all, she designed inexpensive furnishings, unlike the Grand Confort that was so expensive to produce, that middle class and working class people might afford, as can be seen in this living room. And in French, the full title is Salle de séjour à budget populaire. In other words, a living room for those with a popular or low-income budget, that she displayed now at the Salon des Arts Ménagers that I mentioned earlier that Breton and Berneige were involved with. In addition, at this same Salon exposition, she used photomontage as a way of making Parisians aware of the deplorable urban conditions in which so many lived. In fact, this may have been the largest public photomontage done in France at the time, obviously inspired by Soviet and Eastern European efforts at the time. She displayed a 60-foot, it was 60 feet long, or 20 meters, titled The Grand Misery of Paris. It was full of political slogans, captions, decrying unemployment. It's the height of the Depression in France. The distribution of wealth, wretched housing, I'm quoting her, and called for action in more humane living conditions. One caption read, "Liberate natural and cultural riches for the benefit of all men." And she was deeply, here's a reconstruction of it at a recent exhibition in Paris. It was colored. This is the best they could do in recreating it. It's too small, though, to really see. And this egalitarian social vision would stay with Perriand throughout her life. Whether working in Japan, here's her bamboo chaise longue in wood, another display in Japan, Indonesia, where she was during World War II, Brazil, or Paris. And once again, for Le Corbusier, when she designed the Unité kitchen at Marseille, notice again with an open connection between kitchen and dining. It also became, I think, more culturally diverse over time, even eclectic, hardly an image of universal modernity. And I think it's really time we dispense with these cliches about modernism as universal, homogeneous, all-controlling. I think modern architecture was really much more diverse, and Perriand's work embodies that. I'd like to conclude with another anecdote. In 1997, the Architecture League of New York invited her at the age of 94 to come to the city. It was her first trip to the U.S., other than one brief airplane layover in San Francisco coming back from Japan to Paris. And to mount an exhibition and to give a lecture about her work. I might just add, we had designed this little exhibition, borrowing pieces from Paris, and when she comes over, Charlotte, in like 10 minutes at most, totally redesigns the exhibition. Much better, I might say, than what we had done. But in the lecture, and this is the point I want to make, she spoke freely, without notes, answering questions on everything from her own designs to the internet. Someone in the audience asked her what would she most like to do next in her life. She's 94. And she answered with a smile, design for a Kia. Now, I don't think, do you have a Kia here? No. A Kia, for those who don't know it, is this Swedish, rather global, it's all over Europe and in the US, cheap furnishing store, and everybody, IKEA, do you have it? Okay. Okay, but you get the idea. Okay, so she says, I'd like to design for a Kia. And here's a Kia, built-in storage cabinets like her Cassier, and prefab modern kitchens with continuous counters. But I can't help thinking that in many ways, what she so eagerly sought, efficient, inexpensive furnishings, accessible to many, have really been realized, if without the elegance and joy that she would have brought to these efforts. Thanks. I can't tell you what a joy she was to know and meet. She was one of those people, probably like Burle Marx, where creativity just oozed out of her fingers. She was amazing. And I just hope she gets her due in future history classes, etc. Okay, I've talked a lot. Does anyone have questions about the talk? Yes.
Let's organize so
Okay. So talk.
maybe you can come here
Yeah.
in the front while they
I shouldn't, yeah, yeah. You can turn off this, put the Zoom on, and I'll move over for whoever has questions or.
here. Okay.
Stay here.
But
And
come,
Clara also was here in the Zoom. So
Okay. come forward.
we are organizing the I saw you.
So what is the best position?
It's okay.
I stay here, but should we move some mic?
Here so they can.
Oh, okay. My goodies. Even if I have a sugar high.
At the 30s, I can see a very relationship with Lina Bobardi,
Yes.
and that the liberated that came with tradition plus modern as the standardization design of furniture. Like when I saw this chair, the wooden glass, I remember the girafinha chair of Lina,
Yes.
and I think it's really special, this connection. I don't know if they meet each other or something like that.
Yeah, they did meet each other. I don't think, I gathered they did. I asked Charlotte about Lena. Of course, Lena is was somewhat younger, born a bit later. She got her degree, was it 36 or 38? And she comes to Brazil after World War II. But I think it's important to acknowledge that both of them, like many other architects in the 30s, began to reassess the rigid sort of machine aesthetic of the 20s. Even Hannes Meyer, I don't know if you know his work, hardcore rationalist to the end. If you look at his houses that he designed in Switzerland in the 30s, they started using stone. Corbusier owned little houses in the 30s, Mott, Maison de Weekend, Mandreau, and probably most of all, the unbuilt Erasmus house for Chile used rubble, would get rid of, actually, they get rid of pilotis, even if they stay in Brazil. Anyway, so there's a larger shift. I think Lena was very touched by this change in sensibility and, of course, brought her own interest and her own sensibility and was so moved. I think the more she was in Brazil, the more she was touched by folk culture, craft. Because if you look at the difference between the museum in Sao Paulo, which is pretty tough, and then you look at what she did at Second Pompeia, there's just such a change in sensibility, or the stair in Salvador or whatever. And you guys know much more than I do about her. But I really think you're right to see this affinity. I asked Charlotte about Lena, and I think she was kind of evasive. I think she said, yes, I met her, I knew Habitat, I knew that world, but I'm not sure they were such close friends. I think they were both grand dames. I think they liked being their own centers of attention, but also Perion was based in Rio, and Lena was in Sao Paulo, and then spent time in Salvador in the Northeast. So I'm not sure how much they intersected. And there was that division, as you guys know better than I do, between Sao Paulo and Rio. But you're right, and again, Lena is a perfect example that modernism is not one thing.
Yeah, it's not actually, you don't need to deny your traditions to be modern.
Yeah.
And then I went to Salvador in
Yeah.
April with Professor Natalia at
Yeah.
her discipline, and I saw some few works of Lena, and then I could really see this Casa do Benin. I don't know
Yeah.
if you know.
Not well. All I saw the stair in the museum, but I don't know all of Lena's work in Salvador.
Yeah, it's really, really good.
Yeah. No, but I'm such a fan of her work, and I think they both brought their own sensibility to modern architecture.
Thanks a lot.
You.
I think Mara has a question, Mary. Pergunta se ela está ouvindo. Ela não está falando, né?
Ela estava falando.
We're not hearing, Nora.
Você não vai falar, você não quer perguntar?
Can we turn up the sound, maybe?
Alguém quer perguntar? Você não quer perguntar?
Sem
Okay.
querer.
I have a question. I would like to know if the Bill Savoir, I would like to know if Charlotte Perriand also done the drawings for the bathroom at Villa Savoie because of the chaise longue of the relaxing.
It's not 100% clear. In that period of Le Corbusier Genere's office, who did what isn't, there was something called the Black Book, Livre Noir, and they had to sign drawings. But in that point, they were very erratic. The atelier was quite little and very informal. I think she had some role, and Jacques Barsac and Pernette Perriand, her daughter, claimed that. I don't know totally, but there's no question that it was inspired by the Salon d'Automne, the open bathing with the bedroom first, this radical gesture. How many people have open bathrooms to their master bedroom? It's not real clear. And I actually saw in Australia, one of the few exceptions to this, a wonderful, I forgot his name. He's getting old now, kind of hippie Australian architect. had a shower in the middle of his kitchen with no walls around it. It had a tile floor and a drain. So a few people have lived this more radical lifestyle, but Madame Savoie was quite conventional, but clearly it was okay to have her master bedroom suite, but not quite as radical as having your guest bedroom suite joining the master bedroom suite with the bathroom in between. They were unconventional for their period in time. And I still remember Charlotte saying divorce for her was liberation. She had enough with her proper English husband.
Senta aqui, senta nessa cadeira porque
Are we still working on the sound with
I think
Mara?
yes.
Okay.
Ah,
Well, as I told you before, I know a lot of French culture, but I've never heard before about Charlotte Perriand. So I consider that I learned a lot. But something that's not very clear for me, what's the relationship between Le Corbusier and Charlotte? They were often together, working together. What's the image? How did he consider her professionally?
He first, in terms of relationship, they were friends, but they had arguments about politics by 37. She was further left than he was, but it was really more personal. She had a group of very left, sort of young Marxist friends called Les Jeunes, and they had a falling out because she thought they should be part of the 1937 exhibition, and Corbu wanted the Tom Nouveau pavilion he was doing not to include them. So there were some personal differences and some political differences. But she was involved, if you want to know the dirt, with his cousin, Pierre Jeanneret. And she basically, they had a very intense relationship in the 30s. And this bothered Le Corbusier. He thought that she was distracting Pierre in the office. And he even sent her to Russia to work on the Central Soyuz project. And you can tell it was to get her out of the office in part. She was actually very excited about going. She went twice to Russia, to Soviet Union, to work on the Central Soyuz, and thought about staying there, as did many modernists after the rise of Hitler and fascism. But she didn't stay there, and in fact, in Russia, she defends Le Corbusier. So her relationship is like that. He gives her credit, as I said, in precision. He calls her in charge of domestic equipment in the book, published in 1930, in his lectures in South America. And he also wrote that certificate I showed, saying that she was strong. She clearly wanted it in writing. She also joined the copyright when the three furniture pieces, often when an office copyrights something, it's in the name of the firm. In this case, it was the name of the three individuals. And to this day, although the copyright's going to end very soon, the furniture, the proceeds of the sales of the furniture that are mass made now by Cassina, 1/3 goes to the Perriand family, 1/3 goes to the Fondation Le Corbusier, and 1/3 goes to the Jeanneret family. So not only did Corbu give her credit, but she demanded credit. But there was one bad incident, strangely, with a woman. I'm such a gossip. Heidi Weber, and you probably know the Zurich Pavilion, sometimes called the Heidi Weber Pavilion in Zurich, other times called the Le Corbusier Pavilion now. was a young, charming art gallery person, very taken with Corbu, or he was taken with her, who knows. And she decided she wanted to reproduce the furniture. And she did it totally under Le Corbusier's name. No Pierre, no Charlotte. And Charlotte had a fit, but Le Corbusier promptly wrote Heidi Weber and said Charlotte and Pierre's name must be on the furniture. But this myth that they're Corbu chairs, I had to correct the Museum of Modern Art. When I first saw the furniture on display at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, it was under the name Le Corbusier. And I blame MoMA a lot, as I said in my earlier lecture, for some of the stereotypes excluding women, especially Philip Johnson. Okay. Mara?
Você vai conectar?
We're trying to get it to work.
To hear them.
While we're waiting,
Because Fernando and Mariana wants to make a question,
Okay.
but we are not hearing them from the meeting call. Carlos will try to connect the audio for them.
are they in Rio or in Porto Alegre?
Fernando is here in Recife.
Oh, but listening on Zoom.
but listening. And Mariana, I don't know if she's in.
Okay. I will say for those on Zoom that if we don't get to all the questions today, I don't know if you can hear me, definitely save them for tomorrow because there'll be plenty of time. I mean, Friday. I did have coffee. Friday, excuse me, Friday. There'll be plenty of time for questions and discussions. I'm going to sightsee tomorrow.
Olha, tem aqui Mariana.
The other thing we could do is have them write the question in the chat. Oh, it's muted. We need to unmute.
Então, muito baixo.
Cadê o microfone?
Translate. If someone wants to ask a question in Portuguese, we can translate.
No, I was just telling that I have a problem with my camera. Just stopped to work. I don't know. But can you hear me?
I can hear you.
That's perfect.
Speak as loudly as you can.
Yes, thank you for your lecture, Professor Matula. I think you said very well how this literature did change with this contact with this collaborative work with Charlotte Perry, and I think she emphasized the issues of comfort, of this relaxed way of living. And I believe that it was maybe this is related more for a kind of body, more her attention to more bodily questions, more bodily issues. But she was really concerned with the use of these spaces and furniture. I think that's very different from the Germans and the Breuer very rational approach.
Yes.
But my question is about because we from history of architecture we know very little about his work after this collaboration with Le Corbusier. Most of history of architecture books, the mainstream history, her work only appears that notes on this period with Le Corbusier. Of course, we have different disciplines. There is history of design, and I would like to know how is her reception on this history of design books? How is her work from the 50s and 60s considered by the historiography? Because, as we know, in history of architecture books, she is very little known. Could you elaborate more on that?
Okay. First, before I go, understood the question and I'll repeat it. But tell me, Fernando, if I did not understand. You were asking, we don't have much about her reception in architecture books yet, but you asked about how her reception was in design history. Is that correct?
Being considered, particularly her later work after Le Corbusier.
Yes.
And the
Okay.
60s.
I would say that it's beginning to be there. Jacques Bersac, her son-in-law, published 4 very huge, thick volumes about her work. And there's been a lot of exhibitions. In Paris, there was a big one at Louis Vuitton showing the whole range of her work. There was one in London recently. We still have not had a major exhibition other than the little one I helped with at the Architecture League in the 90s. I don't know that there's been an exhibition of her work at all in Latin America. But in Europe, she's beginning to be rather broadly known. What's weird is at the time, she was quite well known. Before she even worked for Le Corbusier, her projects were published in the US in a local newspaper called the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. Her projects were known in Japan, where she was working. There were 2 big exhibition catalogs. There have been exhibitions about her work in Japan, but I think it's hit or miss how well known she is. I would love it if someone would do a really good research on her work in Brazil. I tried when I visited Rio the first time to find the traces. She designed a little apartment complex. Her husband worked for Air France, and for a while, he was in charge of Air France South America, and they were stationed in Rio. Perion always liked to live wherever she had work. She didn't like to travel when she didn't have work. And she designed this sort of series of little apartments, maybe 4 or so in a row. I don't know if it was in Laban. It was further down the beach. And she did this tourist office. She designed some furniture here too. I saw some of it in a gallery exhibition in Paris, but I didn't get photos then, and now I regret it because I don't have photos of her Brazil work. But it would be a great project, and maybe you all should have a big exhibition of her work. I would be glad to help you make the contacts if someone is interested. It would be a great subject. But I don't know if I answered the question or not. But I thought it was something to do with reception outside of architecture, if I understood.
Yes. Thank you.
Parece que agora foi, não? Por favor. Vamos ver se escuta.
Okay, hi, Mariana.
Não, não
Is it
estou.
working?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
It sounds
Hi, Maria.
So I was reading about the Hotskis kitchen,
Yeah.
and we can see that there was this big effort to separate all the drudgery and the mess that goes on in the kitchen from the rest of the house. And we see in Perian's example that she integrated the living room and the kitchen, and I would like to know why. Why did they not have this necessity to separate the space between one and another?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And as I tried to present, when I was talking about kitchens last week, there was a debate about the living kitchen versus the work kitchen. And Lohotsky's kitchen was definitely a work kitchen. And for whatever reason, maybe it's the smells of German cooking versus French cooking. God, I'm going to get into trouble. But Lohotsky saw it as I said, first work, then pleasure. Periant, who liked to entertain and talk with her friends while she cooked, preferred the more open strategy. Although sometimes I think we overestimate Lohotsky's kitchen as shut off from dining, because nobody talks about the big sliding door between the dining area and the kitchen. So you could open it up, but it never was as much a kind of aesthetic move as it was in Periant. It's interesting to see this debate. In the US, we had modern architects by the 30s really started to do open kitchens, more than just the pass-through window. I don't think it really hits Europe in a big way until, although we saw that cartoon I showed, really hits Europe a lot until after World War II. But as I said, there are always exceptions. The country kitchen was often seen as a place everybody gathered. And working class public housing in France had no separate dining room. So there are these class distinctions that are there. But you're right, there's a difference between Lohotsky's kitchen and Periant's kitchen. And the other big difference, as I said, is Periant's was a lot more expensive. All this chrome. And there was even a debate whether to have an electric or gas stove. I'm not even sure what finally got used. Some publications say electric, some say gas. It looked like a gas in one photo to me, but it doesn't seem to have been hooked up. Probably couldn't be in an exhibition. But only about less than 20 people had electric stoves in 1929 in Paris. So the idea of doing an electric stove would have been absurd. But Lohotsky is just much more practical at that point. Periant becomes practical, but she's still not so practical when she does that exhibition. And as I said, some of the furniture ended up being quite expensive. It was meant to be cheap, but the Grand Confort was, Thonet produced the siège à basculant, the swinging back chair, and the chaise longue, but they said the Grand Confort was just nobody could afford to buy it. The only one I know, I think they made 3 copies at that moment in time, and one of them was bought by the very rich bachelor La Roche, who had half of the double house Chauderet La Roche. He did not have an open kitchen, but that house was designed in 23 to 25.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not sure I gave you a real answer, except that they're different.
Yeah, you did. And I understand that Lihotsky's model was actually made for mass production.
Yeah.
It was not the case with Periant,
Yeah.
so they are totally different.
They are. And Lohotsky's model was not only made for serial production, but it inspired many more copies than Periant's at that moment in time. Lohotsky really, Scandinavians just endorsed it right away and tried to copy it.
Ok. Mais perguntas daqui? da audiência pernambucana.
Did Mara have a question?
E Mara no.
Okay. So it's late.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's time for some lunch, but you should talk to Gila or anyone about if you have a presentation or a discussion in reading. If you have time, please read the readings on the everyday for tomorrow. I'm going to show a very short film and talk about one quote. Gila's going to make a presentation, but we're not going to fill up 3 hours unless you guys talk. Okay.
Vou falar agora. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary, for your lovely and how I say intelligent and everything in very deep research lecture. It was really a pleasure to see it, and we are very thankful for your presence here. And I'm inviting everyone to Friday and the same hour. And which one that wants to present a paper that it's related with the
General topic. It doesn't have to be an individual woman. It could be on magazines. It could be on popular culture.
yes.
The servant question. Anything you wish.
10 minutes, okay, and we are going to organize it. So you have to send me the email, okay, because I have to do the list, okay, and to organize everything for Friday.
Someone from Rio and
Also, the people from Rio de Janeiro and Porto Alegre, okay, Mara and Sergio, you could organize this for me so we can fulfill all the 3 hours with good discussions, okay, of course, and a lot of questions also.
Yes, and if we don't fill up 3 hours, it's not the end of the world.
So thank you very much, everyone. Okay, and until see you on Friday. Thank you very much. Okay.